She had been taught to fear the worst. A young Japanese woman, no more than 22, stood trembling at the entrance of an American prisoner camp in the Philippines, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears. Behind her, 12 other women huddled together, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies rigid with anticipation of what they believed was inevitable. They had been captured 3 days earlier, pulled from the wreckage of a field hospital as American forces swept through the region. For 3 days, they had waited for the violence they had been promised would come. It never did. The first American soldier who approached was tall, sunburned, with tired eyes that seemed older than his face. He stopped several feet away, holding his hands up, palms open, as though approaching a wounded animal. He spoke words she did not understand, his voice low and careful. Then he gestured toward the camp entrance, a simple motion that said, "This way." He did not reach for her. He did not touch her at all. He simply turned and walked, expecting them to follow. The women exchanged confused glances. One whispered that it must be a trap, that the real horror would begin once they were inside. But what choice did they have? They followed, their steps hesitant, their breath shallow. Inside the camp, they were led to a row of wooden barracks. The air smelled of canvas and sawdust, tinged faintly with the scent of food cooking somewhere nearby. A female American nurse appeared, her uniform crisp, her expression professional but not unkind. Through broken gestures and simple words, she explained that they would be given beds, blankets, and a meal. The young woman stared at the nurse's face, searching for cruelty, for contempt, for the leer she had been taught to expect. She found none of it. The nurse simply handed her a towel and pointed toward a washing station. That night, lying on a thin mattress beneath a rough wool blanket, the young woman could not sleep. Her body was exhausted, but her mind raced. She kept waiting for the door to burst open, for hands to drag her into the night, for the nightmare her commanders had described in vivid, horrifying detail. But the door remained closed. The only sounds were the soft breathing of the other women and the distant murmur of guards speaking quietly among themselves. No one came. No one touched her. The realization was almost more frightening than the violence she had anticipated because it shattered everything she thought she knew about the enemy. The myth they carried. For years, Japanese women serving in auxiliary roles, nurses, clerks, communications operators, had been indoctrinated with a singular message about capture by Allied forces. The instructions were explicit and terrifying. If captured by Americans, they could expect assault, humiliation, and torture. Officers spoke of it in hushed, grave tones. Pamphlets described it in language designed to shock. Training sessions hammered the point home again and again. The enemy was barbaric, especially toward women. Better to take one's own life than fall into their hands. Better to die with honor than live with shame. Some women carried cyanide capsules, tiny glass vials tucked into the folds of their uniforms. Others kept grenades close, understanding that the final explosion was meant not for the enemy, but for themselves. Suicide drills were practiced with the same rigor as medical procedures. The message was clear. Your body is a battlefield, and you must destroy it before the enemy claims it. This was not just military policy. It was woven into the cultural fabric, an extension of Bushido values that had filtered down from samurai tradition into the consciousness of ordinary citizens. Death before dishonor, purity through sacrifice. The body defiled was worse than the body destroyed. The propaganda was relentless. Posters depicted American soldiers as monstrous figures, leering and predatory. Stories circulated of captured women subjected to unimaginable horrors, though few could name the sources of these tales. The narratives fed on themselves, growing darker with each retelling. Women whispered these stories to one another in barracks and hospitals, their fear compounding until it became a kind of collective hysteria. To be captured was to be erased, not just killed, but violated so thoroughly that death would seem a mercy. This was the gospel they were taught, and most believed it absolutely. Yet what made the indoctrination so effective was not just fear, but shame. The emphasis was not only on what would be done to them, but on what their capture would mean for their families. To surrender was to bring dishonor upon parents, siblings, ancestors stretching back generations. The shame would be inherited, passed down like a curse. Better to disappear entirely, to become a statistic of heroic resistance, than to return home bearing the stain of survival. For many women, this was the heaviest burden, not the fear of pain, but the fear of becoming a source of family disgrace. The young woman in the barracks had internalized all of this. She had memorized the evacuation protocols that were never really about evacuation, but about ensuring no woman fell into enemy hands alive. She had practiced the motions of removing the pin from a grenade, understanding that the blast was meant to take her with it. She had whispered prayers to ancestors, asking forgiveness for the dishonor she might bring if she faltered in that final moment. And when the American forces closed in on the field hospital, she had reached for the cyanide capsule in her pocket, her fingers trembling, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. But she had hesitated. In that fraction of a second, fear of death overcame fear of capture. Or perhaps it was something else, a flicker of doubt, a question she barely dared to ask herself. What if the stories were wrong? The capsule remained in her pocket as hands pulled her from the rubble, as voices shouted in a language she did not know, as she was herded with the others into a truck that carried them away from the battlefield. She had failed to die. Now she would face the consequences. Except the consequences did not come. The first shock, distance. The initial days in the camp were defined not by what happened, but by what did not happen. The women were placed in a separate section of the compound, barracks designated specifically for female prisoners. Male guards patrolled the perimeter, but they maintained a clear distance. When they spoke, they did so from several feet away, their body language careful, almost awkward. They did not enter the barracks unless accompanied by a female nurse or translator. They did not linger. They did not stare. This behavior was so unexpected that it registered as suspicious. The young woman watched the guards constantly, trying to detect the moment when the mask would slip, when the careful distance would collapse into violence. She noted the way they turned their backs when the women changed clothes, the way they knocked before entering, even though they had every right to simply walk in, the way they averted their eyes when handing over supplies. It made no sense. These were conquerors. These were the demons of propaganda. Why were they acting like nervous schoolboys? One afternoon, a guard dropped a bundle of blankets near the barracks entrance and quickly retreated. One of the older women, a nurse who had survived the bombing of a hospital ship, approached the bundle cautiously. She unwrapped it to find not just blankets but sanitary supplies, small bars of soap, and even a few combs. The items were practical, almost mundane, but their presence was astonishing. Our women, a nurse who had survived the bombing of a hospital ship, approached the bundle cautiously. She unwrapped it to find not just blankets but sanitary supplies, small bars of soap, and even a few combs. The items were practical, almost mundane, but their presence was astonishing. As the war dragged toward its conclusion, more women arrived at the camp, evacuated from field hospitals, communications posts, administrative offices. Each group arrived with the same terror in their eyes, the same rigid posture, the same expectation of violence. And each group, over time, underwent the same transformation. The fear did not disappear entirely, but it evolved into something more complex. Confusion, relief, guilt, gratitude, and beneath it all, a slow-burning anger at the lies they had been told. The young woman found herself in the strange position of helping to orient the newcomers, explaining the rules, demonstrating that the guards would not harm them. It was disorienting to be the voice of reassurance about the enemy. She watched the new arrivals watch the guards, saw the same hypervigilance she had once felt, the same defensive tension, and she wanted to tell them, "You can relax. You are safe here." But those words felt impossible, even now. How could safety exist in captivity? How could the enemy offer protection? Yet the evidence was undeniable. Some women had been in the camp for over a year now, and not one had been assaulted, harassed, or violated. Not one. The statistical improbability of that fact, set against the propaganda they had been fed, created a kind of cognitive dissonance that was almost unbearable. If the Americans were capable of such sustained restraint, such systematic respect, then what did that say about the Japanese command that had convinced them to fear death less than capture? One woman, a clerk who had worked in an administrative office in Manila, put it bluntly one night. "They lied to us. Our own officers lied. They told us the Americans were animals, but they are the ones who taught us that our bodies were worthless. They told us to die rather than be touched, but they touched us with violence every day. They made us afraid of the wrong enemy." Her words were met with shocked silence. To speak such thoughts aloud was dangerous, even here. But the silence that followed was not disagreement. It was recognition. The women understood, even if they could not yet fully articulate it, that the greatest violation had not come from American hands. It had come from the system that taught them their own bodies were disposable, that their worth was measured only in their willingness to destroy themselves. The young woman lay in her bunk that night thinking about touch. The touch that had never come from the guards. The touch that had come, gentle and clinical, from doctors. The touch of the nurse's hand on her shoulder when she wept. The accidental brush of fingers when receiving a food tray, quickly withdrawn with a muttered apology. Each instance of touch, or the deliberate absence of it, had been a form of communication. And what it communicated was this: your body is yours. Even here, even now, even in captivity, your body belongs to you. That realization was more devastating than any assault could have been, because it forced her to confront the fact that her own nation had never granted her that sovereignty. Her body, in the eyes of the empire, had always been state property. The Americans, her enemies, were the first to treat it as her own. The silence after the war. When the war ended and repatriation began, the women faced a choice about what to speak and what to silence. Some decided never to mention the camp, to bury the experience so deep it might never surface. Others felt compelled to testify, to tell the truth about what had and had not happened. Both choices were forms of survival. The young woman returned to a Japan that was unrecognizable, not just physically destroyed but psychologically shattered. The emperor had spoken on the radio, his voice thin and human, admitting defeat. The divine had become mortal overnight. In that context, her own story seemed almost trivial. Yet she carried it with her, a secret knowledge that would shape everything that followed. She found work with the occupation forces, translating, helping to rebuild. She watched American soldiers walk through her ruined city with the same careful distance they had maintained in the camp. She watched them hand out rations to starving children, watched them set up medical stations, watched them enforce rules without brutality. And she understood that what she had witnessed in the camp was not an aberration. It was a different system, one with its own flaws, certainly, but built on premises fundamentally unlike those she had been raised with. Years later, when researchers began interviewing former prisoners about their experiences, the young woman, now middle-aged, agreed to speak. She chose her words carefully, aware of how they might sound, how they might be misunderstood or weaponized. She said, "The Americans did not touch us. That is the most important thing I can tell you. They maintained distance. They maintained respect. We were prisoners, yes, but we were treated as human. I do not say this to praise the enemy or to condemn my country. I say it because it is true, and because that truth taught me something I carry still. That even in war, even between enemies, humanity can survive. It survived in the space between us, in the touch that was withheld, in the acknowledgement that my body was not theirs to claim." The interviewer asked if she had been afraid during her captivity. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Yes," she said finally. "I was terrified, but not of what happened, of what didn't happen. Because the absence of violence was so unexpected, it shattered everything I thought I knew about the world. And building a new understanding from those shattered pieces, that was the hardest thing I have ever done. The legacy of distance." The story of Japanese female POWs and the Americans who did not touch them is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a story about the power of restraint, about the ways that treating prisoners with basic dignity can be both a humanitarian act and a strategic weapon. It is a story about propaganda and the devastating effects of lies told to make people fear death less than capture. And it is a story about the bodies of women used as battlegrounds for larger ideological wars. The women who survived this experience carried its lessons in different ways. Some became advocates for peace, speaking publicly about the lies of war propaganda. Others retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to reconcile their experiences with the narratives demanded by post-war Japanese society. A few immigrated to America, seeking lives in the country they had once been taught to fear. Each response was valid, each a way of metabolizing trauma and revelation. What remains consistent across their testimonies is the centrality of touch or its absence. To be a woman in war is to have your body politicized, to have it become a symbol and a target. The Japanese command politicized their bodies by teaching them to destroy themselves. The American command politicized their bodies by treating them with visible restraint. Neither approach was neutral. Both were shaped by military objectives. But the effects on the women themselves were profoundly different. One woman, interviewed in her 80s, said, "I am grateful I was not touched, but I am also angry that I needed to be grateful. My body should have been inviolate from the beginning, not as a gift from my captors, but as a basic right." The Americans respected that right. My own country did not. That is a complicated truth to carry for a lifetime. The young woman from the field hospital, the one who hesitated with the cyanide capsule, lived into her 90s. She never married, never had children. She worked as a translator for decades, building bridges between the languages and cultures that had once been at war. When asked late in life what she remembered most vividly from her time in the camp, she did not mention the food or the blankets or the medical care. She mentioned the guard who carried her bucket of water and walked away without a word. "That moment," she said, "when he helped me and expected nothing in return, when he touched the bucket but not me, when he maintained that small distance that said, 'You are safe,' that was when I knew the war had lied to me about what it meant to be human." In the end, the story of these women is not about American virtue or Japanese shame. It is about the power of human decency to survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. It is about the revelation that comes when expectations of cruelty are met instead with restraint. It is about bodies that were taught they were worthless discovering, through the deliberate non-touch of supposed enemies, that they had worth all along. That discovery, quiet and profound, echoing through generations, a reminder that even in war, the choice to recognize another's humanity remains possible. And sometimes, that choice is made not through grand gestures, but through the simple revolutionary act of keeping one's hands to oneself. The unlearning. The hardest part came after liberation, when the women returned to a society that had no framework for their experience. The young woman found herself sitting across from her uncle in what remained of the family home, trying to explain what had happened during her captivity. He listened in silence, his face impassive, his hands folded carefully in his lap. When she finished, he said quietly, "It would have been better if you had not survived." The words hung in the air like smoke, not cruel exactly, but matter of fact, a statement of cultural reality. She had surrendered. She had lived. These facts, regardless of how they had unfolded, carried a stain that no amount of explanation could wash away. Her uncle was not condemning her personally. He was simply articulating what many thought but did not say, that survival through capture was a form of failure, a crack in the perfect vessel of national honor. She left his house that day and never returned. But his words followed her, settling into the hollow spaces where her old certainties had once lived. She began to understand that she would spend the rest of her life unlearning the lessons of her youth, unlearning the equation of suffering with virtue, unlearning the idea that her body was a commodity to be managed by others, unlearning the belief that death was preferable to the violation of abstract codes. Each unlearning was painful, like pulling threads from a tapestry until the original image became unrecognizable. Other women faced similar reckonings. One former prisoner, a woman who had worked in military communications, returned to her village to find that no one would speak to her directly. They acknowledged her presence with sideways glances and careful distance, as though dishonor were contagious. She was not shunned openly. That would have been too direct, too cruel by Japanese standards. Instead, She was rendered invisible through silence. Within 6 months, she had moved to Tokyo, where anonymity offered a different kind of freedom. Another woman, younger and more defiant, spoke openly about her experiences at a gathering of war widows. She described the food, the medical care, the respect maintained by the guards. She thought her testimony would bring comfort, proof that their sons and husbands, if captured, might have been treated with similar dignity. Instead, the women turned away from her, their faces hardening. One elderly widow stood and left without a word. The message was clear. Your truth is not welcome here. We have constructed our grief around certain assumptions. Do not dismantle them with your survival. The young woman from the field hospital learned to parse her words carefully. When asked about her time as a prisoner, she spoke in generalities. It was difficult, but I survived. She did not mention the meals that had filled her stomach for the first time in years. She did not speak of the blankets or the medical care or the guards who maintained respectful distance. These truths were too dangerous, too disruptive to the narratives that allowed people to make sense of their losses. So she learned the art of strategic silence, revealing only what would not disturb the fragile peace others had built around their pain. Yet silence had its own cost. Each time she swallowed the truth, each time she nodded along with someone's assumption that captivity must have been hellish in ways it was not, she felt something inside her harden. The gap between lived experience and permitted narrative became a kind of internal exile. She was home, but not really. She was free, but not entirely. She carried within her a story that could not be told, and that untold story became a weight she bore alone. The price of speaking. A few women refused the silence. They wrote letters to newspapers, gave interviews to foreign journalists, spoke at gatherings despite the social consequences. Their testimonies were detailed and unflinching. The Americans had treated them not as enemies to be degraded, but as prisoners to be managed with a degree of humanity that had shocked them. These women became controversial figures, praised by some as truth-tellers, condemned by others as traitors or fools who had been manipulated by enemy propaganda. One woman, a former nurse named Akiko, became particularly outspoken. She wrote a memoir detailing her capture, her terror, and the gradual realization that the violence she had been promised would never materialize. Her book sold poorly in Japan, but was translated into English and widely read in America, where it reinforced narratives about American moral superiority. Akiko found herself caught between two propaganda machines. In Japan, she was seen as someone who had betrayed national dignity by praising the enemy. In America, she was held up as proof of American virtue, her nuanced account flattened into a simpler story of good guys and bad guys. She gave a lecture in Tokyo in 1952, 7 years after the war's end. The room was half empty, and those who came seemed to do so out of morbid curiosity rather than genuine interest. She spoke about the policy of non-contact, about the female nurses who had served as intermediaries, about the meals and the medical care and the letters home. When she finished, a man in the back stood and asked, "Were you paid to say these things?" The question stung not because it was aggressive, but because it was earnest. He genuinely believed that no Japanese woman could speak positively of American treatment unless she had been compensated or coerced. The possibility that she was simply telling the truth did not register as plausible. Akiko responded carefully, "I was not paid. I am not a propagandist. I am simply someone who lived through something and is trying to make sense of it by speaking about it. If that makes me uncomfortable to listen to, I understand, but I will not be silent about what I know to be true." The lecture ended in awkward silence. A few people approached her afterward, thanking her quietly for her courage, but most filed out without acknowledging her, their faces carefully blank. She walked home alone that night, wondering if speaking the truth was worth the isolation it brought. She never found a clear answer to that question. The women who chose America. A small number of former prisoners made a more radical choice. They immigrated to the United States. For these women, the decision was not about betraying Japan, but about seeking a place where their experiences might be understood, or at least not actively denied. They came as war brides, marrying American soldiers they had met during the occupation. They came as students, seeking education at American universities. They came as workers, taking jobs with companies that operated in both countries. Each path was its own form of exile. The young woman from the field hospital was one of them. In 1950, 5 years after her release from the camp, she boarded a ship bound for San Francisco. She carried a single suitcase containing a few clothes, her identification papers, and a photograph of her mother, taken before the war when there had still been enough food to keep flesh on bones. She stood at the ship's rail as Japan receded into the distance, and she felt not grief, but a strange, complicated relief. In America, she found work as a translator for a government agency. Her days were spent bridging languages, converting Japanese documents into English, English reports into Japanese. The work was technical, dry, but she found it satisfying. Each translation was an act of connection, a small proof that understanding across difference was possible. Her colleagues were polite, curious about her background, but respectful when she declined to elaborate. She appreciated. Someone had thought about their needs. Someone had considered their dignity. The older woman held up a comb, turning it over in her hands as though it were an artifact from another world. "They gave us combs," she said quietly. "Why would they give us combs?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. A comb was such a small thing, yet it implied something radical, that their appearance mattered, that they were expected to maintain themselves, that they were not being reduced to animals. The young woman took one of the combs and ran it through her tangled hair, wincing as it caught on knots. The simple act of grooming felt forbidden, as though she were indulging in vanity while her nation bled. Yet the comb had been given by the enemy. Did that make it a gift or a weapon? Or a food arrived 3 times a day, delivered by a rotation of soldiers who set down trays and left without lingering? The portions were substantial, far more than the women had eaten in months. There was bread, canned meat, vegetables, sometimes fruit. The first time the young woman bit into an orange, the burst of sweetness on her tongue was so intense she gasped. She had not tasted fresh fruit in over a year. Around her, other women ate in silence, their faces registering the same shock. This was not the starvation rations they had anticipated. This was not the near poison they had been told to expect. This was food that tasted like food, prepared with something approaching care. Yet the abundance itself became a source of anxiety. Why were they being fed so well? Was it to fatten them up for something worse? Was it to make them compliant, to soften their resistance? The older nurse voiced these suspicions one evening, her voice tight with distrust. "They want something from us," she said. "This kindness is strategic. We must not forget who they are." The young woman nodded, but privately she wondered. If kindness was a weapon, it was unlike any weapon she had been trained to recognize. It left no visible wounds, yet it destabilized her in ways violence never could. The medical examinations were perhaps the strangest experience. Each woman was called individually to a small clinic within the camp. The young woman entered, her heart racing, expecting the worst. Instead, she found a male doctor and a female nurse, both wearing white coats, both looking at her with expressions of professional concern. The doctor gestured for her to sit, then began examining her through the nurse as translator. He checked her eyes, her throat, listened to her lungs. When he discovered an infected cut on her arm, he cleaned it carefully, his touch clinical, impersonal. He bandaged the wound and made notes on a clipboard. Then he handed her a small bottle of pills, explaining through the translator that she should take one each day to prevent further infection. She stared at the pills, then at his face. He met her gaze briefly, nodded, and turned to wash his hands. That was it. No violation, no humiliation, no exploitation. Just medical care, delivered with the same detachment he might show to any patient. As she left the clinic, clutching the bottle of pills, she felt something crack inside her. It was not relief. It was confusion so profound it bordered on vertigo. Everything she had been taught was proving false, yet she had no framework to understand what was true. The culture of non-contact. What the women could not have known was that their treatment was the result of specific military policy. The American command had issued clear directives regarding female prisoners of war. They were to be housed separately, guarded at a distance, and handled only by female personnel whenever possible. Physical contact was to be minimized. Privacy was to be respected to the greatest extent feasible within a prison camp setting. These rules were not born purely from humanitarian instinct. They were also strategic. American intelligence understood that Japanese propaganda depicted Allied forces as savage and depraved. They knew that captured Japanese soldiers and auxiliaries had been conditioned to expect brutality. By treating prisoners humanely, particularly female prisoners, the Americans hoped to achieve several goals. First, to encourage surrender among Japanese forces still fighting, demonstrating that capture was not the horror they had been promised. Second, to extract intelligence and cooperation more effectively, as people treated with dignity were more likely to share information. Third, to occupy the moral high ground, both for propaganda purposes and for the historical record. But beyond strategy, there was also a cultural element. Many American soldiers came from backgrounds that emphasized respect for women, a value system shaped by different social norms. The idea of assaulting a female prisoner was not just against orders, it was against the code many soldiers had been raised with. Letters home from soldiers stationed at POW camps often expressed surprise at the Japanese women's fear, describing efforts to put them at ease, to show them they had nothing to fear. One soldier wrote to his mother, "They act like we're going to hurt them. We gave them chocolate and they wouldn't take it at first. It's sad, really. What were they told about us?" The female nurses and translators played a crucial role. They became intermediaries, bridges between the terrified prisoners and the male guards. They explained camp rules in broken Japanese, demonstrated that compliance brought safety rather than punishment, and modeled a different kind of authority, one not rooted in domination but in order. The young Japanese woman found herself drawn to one nurse in particular, a woman from California with a calm demeanor and patient gestures. This nurse never raised her voice, never showed impatience, never treated the prisoners as less than human. She simply did her job with quiet competence. Over time, the distance maintained by the male guards began to feel less like a threat deferred and more like respect. The young woman tested this realization cautiously. One day, a guard was walking past as she struggled to carry a heavy bucket of water from the washing station. He paused, gestured to the bucket, and made a lifting motion, clearly offering to carry it for her. She froze, uncertain. Was this a trick? Would accepting help lead to something worse? But he simply waited, patient, his expression neutral. Finally, she nodded. He picked up the bucket, carried it to her barracks, set it down, and walked away without another word. That small exchange stayed with her for days. A man, an enemy soldier, had performed an act of basic courtesy without expecting anything in return. He had not used the moment to assert power, to make demands, to extract some payment. He had simply helped, the way one human might help another. The simplicity of it was staggering. It suggested a world in which enemies could still recognize each other's humanity, a world her training had insisted did not exist. Watching the men who did not look, the women began to study their captors with a new kind of attention. They watched how the soldiers moved through the camp, how they interacted with each other, how they carried themselves. They noticed small things, the way guards turned away when the women bathed, the way they knocked before entering even when the door was open, the way they handed over supplies at arm's length, never allowing their fingers to brush against a prisoner's hand. These behaviors, so carefully maintained, told a story different from the propaganda. One woman, a communications operator who had worked in cipher rooms, began to keep a mental catalog of interactions. She counted how many times guards approached the women's barracks versus how many times they stayed away. She noted the ratio of male to female staff assigned to their section. She observed the camp routines, looking for patterns that might reveal hidden intentions. What she found was consistency. The rules were followed not sporadically, but systematically. The distance was not performative, it was policy. Another woman, younger, perhaps 19, had expected assault so completely that she slept fully dressed for the first 2 weeks, ready to fight or flee. She kept a small piece of broken glass under her pillow, a last line of defense. But as days passed and nothing happened, the exhaustion of constant vigilance wore her down. One night she fell asleep in her clothes, the glass still tucked beneath her pillow. When she woke in the morning, fully intact, untouched, she broke down sobbing. The relief was almost unbearable. The older woman who slept in the next bunk said nothing, simply placed a hand on her shoulder until the crying subsided. The young woman from the field hospital began to notice the way the guards looked at them, or rather, the way they did not look. There was no leering, no invasive stares, no commentary. When guards stood watch, their eyes scanned the perimeter, not the women. When they delivered food, they looked at the trays, not at the prisoners receiving them. This averted gaze was so consistent that it became its own form of communication. It said, "You are safe here. We will not violate that safety. Your fear, though understandable, is not necessary." Yet fear was not easily discarded. It had been their companion for so long, woven so deeply into their sense of the world, that its absence left them unmoored. Some women clung to suspicion as though it were a life raft, refusing to accept the evidence of their own eyes. They invented explanations for the guards' behavior. It was a long game, designed to extract maximum cooperation before the real horrors began. Or perhaps the soldiers were under strict observation from officers and could not act on their true intentions. Or maybe American barbarism was more subtle, psychological rather than physical, a slow erosion of will rather than an immediate assault. But these explanations grew harder to sustain as weeks passed. The young woman found herself arguing with her own suspicions. If this was a trap, it was the longest, most elaborate trap imaginable. If this was psychological warfare, what was its objective? To make them comfortable? To what end? The logic began to unravel. Perhaps, she thought with something approaching vertigo, perhaps the simplest explanation was the true one. The Americans were not going to hurt them because they had no intention of hurting them. It was a thought so radical it felt dangerous to even entertain. The moment of testimony. 6 weeks into captivity, the women were visited by an American officer accompanied by a translator. He explained that they would be allowed to write letters home, to send word to their families that they were alive and well. The announcement was met with stunned silence. Letters? Home? It seemed impossible. Surely such letters would be intercepted, destroyed, used against them somehow. Yet the officer assured them the correspondence would be facilitated through neutral parties, that their families deserved to know they had survived. The young woman was handed paper and a pencil. She stared at the blank page for a long time. What could she possibly say? How could she explain what she had experienced without sounding insane? If she told the truth, that the Americans fed them well, treated them kindly, maintained respectful distance, would her family believe her? Or would they think she had been brainwashed, turned into a traitor, convinced to spread enemy propaganda? The weight of the pencil in her hand felt immense. Finally, she began to write, "Mother, I am alive. I am in an American prison camp. I am not harmed. They feed us. They give us blankets. The guards do not touch us. I know this will be hard to believe. I did not believe it myself at first, but it is true. I am safe. Please do not worry. I will come home when I can." She folded the letter carefully, handed it to the translator, and watched it disappear into a canvas bag with the other letters. She felt as though she had just confessed to a crime. To say she was safe in the hands of the enemy felt like betrayal. Yet it was the truth, and truth, she was learning, could be its own form of resistance. Weeks later, whispers reached the camp that some letters had made it through, that families in Japan were receiving word of their daughter's survival. The responses, when they came, were mixed. Some families expressed relief and gratitude. Others wrote back with thinly veiled shame, their words careful, as though afraid of surveillance, but the message clear. Survival through capture was not the honorable path. One woman received a letter from her father that said simply, "We are glad you live, but we grieve the daughter we knew." The cruelty of those words, precise and devastating, left her silent for days. The young woman received no reply from her mother. She did not know if the letter had arrived, if her mother was alive to receive it, or if shame prevented a response. The silence was its own answer. Yet in the absence of her mother's voice, she found herself listening to other voices, the voices of the women around her, the voices of the nurses and translators, even the quiet, careful voices of the guards who spoke to each other in low tones as they changed shifts. These voices, all of them, were telling her the same thing. She mattered. Her survival was not a betrayal. It was a fact, as real as the meals she ate, the blanket she slept under, the wound that healed on her arm. The revelation of touch withheld. It was not until months into her captivity that the young woman fully understood the significance of what was not happening. She was standing near the barbed wire fence one afternoon, watching a group of male prisoners, Japanese soldiers, being escorted across the compound. They walked in formation, their heads down, their bodies thin, but not skeletal. The guards flanking them maintained the same careful distance she had observed in her own section of the camp. No shoves, no blows, no casual cruelty, just direction and distance. She thought about the soldiers in her own army, the officers who had struck subordinates for minor infractions, who had screamed inches from their faces, who had used physical dominance as a tool of command. She thought about the hierarchies enforced through violence, the understanding that your body was not your own but belonged to the emperor, to be used, broken, or discarded as needed. And she realized with sudden clarity that the Americans' refusal to touch them was not just policy, it was philosophy. It was a statement about power and humanity that ran counter to everything she had known. Power, in her world, had always required contact. To command was to impose yourself physically on another's space. To discipline was to strike. To dominate was to control the body. But here, power operated differently. The Americans held absolute control over the prisoners, life and death. Yet they exercised that control through distance, through rules, through the absence of physical assertion. It was power that acknowledged the prisoner's body as inviolate, even in captivity. That recognition was revolutionary. One evening, the California nurse sat down beside the young woman on the barrack steps. They had developed a tentative rapport over the months, built on broken Japanese, hand gestures, and small acts of kindness. The nurse offered her a cigarette, which the young woman declined, and they sat in comfortable silence watching the sun set over the camp. Finally, the nurse spoke, her Japanese halting but sincere. "You were afraid of us. When you arrived, you thought we would hurt you." It was not a question, but the young woman nodded anyway. The nurse continued. "We knew, we always know, that fear in the eyes. We see it in all the Japanese prisoners. Men too, but especially women. You expect monsters." She paused, took a drag from her cigarette. "We are not monsters. We are just people, same as you." The young woman wanted to argue, to explain that it was not that simple, that their nations were enemies, that the uniform made a difference. But sitting there in the fading light, watching smoke curl from the nurse's cigarette, she found she could not. Because perhaps it was that simple. Perhaps beneath the propaganda and the uniforms and the years of war, there was just this. One person choosing not to harm another. One person maintaining distance out of respect rather than domination. One person seeing humanity across the divide. She appreciated their restraint, the way they allowed her to exist without demanding her entire story. One afternoon in 1953, she was called into a supervisor's office. A man sat there, middle-aged, wearing a military uniform with insignia she recognized from the camp. He stood when she entered, extended his hand for a handshake, then seemed to think better of it and gestured to a chair instead. "Miss Tanaka," he said, using the name she had taken in America. "I understand you were a prisoner of war at the camp in the Philippines." Her heart hammered in her chest. She nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "I was stationed there," he continued. "Not as a guard, but in administration. I reviewed reports, managed supplies, that sort of thing." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I wanted you to know that the policy regarding female prisoners, the non-contact policy, it wasn't easy to enforce. Some soldiers didn't understand why we maintained such strict distance. They thought it was unnecessary, even foolish. But command was adamant. We were to treat you with dignity because it was the right thing to do, yes, but also because it was strategically sound. Prisoners who felt safe were more cooperative. Fear produced compliance, but respect produced genuine assistance. She stared at him, processing this information. He was explaining the machinery behind her survival, the calculations that had preserved her body from violation. Part of her wanted to be angry, to reject the idea that her treatment had been strategic rather than purely humanitarian. But another part, the part that had spent years unlearning absolutes, understood that motivations were rarely pure. Good actions could stem from mixed intentions. Kindness could be both genuine and tactical. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "Because I think you should know that it mattered," he said. "The letters you all wrote home, some of them were intercepted and analyzed. Intelligence learned that Japanese soldiers were beginning to hear about humane treatment in American camps. Surrender rates increased slightly in the final months of the war. Not dramatically, but measurably. Your survival, your testimony, even your presence here in this office, these things have ripple effects. History is not just the big battles, it's also the small choices, the policies that preserve dignity, the guards who kept their distance even when no one was watching." She left his office that day with a new understanding. Her experience had not been an isolated kindness, but part of a larger pattern, a system that, however imperfectly, had chosen restraint over brutality. That system had its own violence, of course. American forces had firebombed Japanese cities, dropped atomic weapons, inflicted horrors that no policy of prisoner treatment could erase. But in the specific arena of her captivity, in the interactions between guards and prisoners, something different had operated. Something that acknowledged, even within the context of war, that certain lines should not be crossed. The daughters who asked questions years passed. The young woman married an American man, a librarian she met at a community event. They had a daughter born in 1958 who grew up knowing only fragments of her mother's past. The daughter, Sarah, knew her mother was Japanese, knew she had come to America after the war, but knew little else. Her mother's silence on the subject was so complete that Sarah learned not to ask, sensing that certain doors were meant to stay closed. But in 1975, when Sarah was 17 and studying World War II in school, she came home with questions. They sat at the kitchen table, her mother's hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. Sarah asked directly, without preamble, "Were you in the war, Mom? Were you a prisoner?" The young woman, now middle-aged with gray threading through her dark hair, was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said simply. What was it like? Where to begin? How to convey the terror that had eventually given way to confusion, then to a revelation so profound it had reshaped her understanding of humanity? She tried. "I was afraid. We all were. We had been told that capture meant torture, assault, death. We had been given poison to take rather than be captured. Some women took it. I did not." She paused, searching her daughter's face for judgment and finding only curiosity. "What happened instead?" Sarah asked. "Nothing happened," her mother said, and then corrected herself. "No, that's not quite right. Many things happened. We were fed. We were given medical care. We were allowed to write letters home. But the thing we feared most, the violence we had been promised would come, never did. The American soldiers kept their distance. They treated us with a kind of careful respect. It was not warm, not friendly exactly, but it was decent. And that decency shattered everything I thought I knew about the enemy." Sarah absorbed this, her teenage mind trying to fit it into the narratives she had learned in school. "So the Americans were good guys?" she asked, the question carrying the simplicity of youth. Her mother shook her head. "It's not that simple. The Americans did terrible things in the war, but in this one area, in their treatment of prisoners, especially women, they chose not to perpetrate certain violences. That choice mattered to me. It saved me, not just physically, but in some deeper way. It taught me that even enemies can choose to see each other's humanity." Sarah frowned. But isn't that what they're supposed to do? Follow the Geneva Convention and all that? Supposed to, yes, her mother agreed. But between what is supposed to happen and what actually happens, there is often a vast distance. In my case, what was supposed to happen did happen. I was lucky. Millions of others were not. That conversation opened a door that had been closed for decades. Over the following years, Sarah asked more questions, and her mother answered them, slowly, carefully, as though each answer required excavating something long buried. She told her daughter about the comb, the orange, the guard who carried her bucket of water. She told her about the women who refused food at first, convinced it was poisoned, and about the gradual erosion of fear into something more complex. She told her about returning to Japan and finding that her survival was seen as shameful, about the uncle who said it would have been better if she had died. Sarah listened with a mixture of horror and fascination. "That's insane," she said at one point. "How could anyone think you should have killed yourself?" "It's not insane when you understand the context," her mother replied. "In that culture, at that time, honor was worth more than life. The body was not your own. It belonged to the emperor, to the nation, to the family. To preserve it through surrender was to fail in your highest duty. I understood that belief once. I even held it myself. It took years to unlearn it, to understand that my life had value regardless of how I preserved it." These conversations changed something between them. Sarah began to see her mother not just as a parent, but as a historical witness, someone who had lived through moments that had shaped the world. She asked if her mother would be willing to speak to her history class, to share her testimony with students who were learning about the war from textbooks that rarely mentioned the experiences of Japanese women. Her mother hesitated. The memory of Akiko's failed lecture, the awkward silence and implied accusations, still stung decades later. But Sarah persisted, and eventually she agreed. In the spring of 1976, she stood before a classroom of American teenagers and told her story. She spoke of the fear, the propaganda, the moment of capture, the shock of humane treatment. She spoke of the guards who kept their distance, the nurses who offered care, the policy that preserved her dignity, even in captivity. And she spoke of the long unlearning that had followed, the decades it had taken to reconcile her experiences with the narratives she had been taught. The students listened, rapt. When she finished, hands shot up with questions. One boy asked, "Do you think the soldiers who guarded you were heroes?" She considered this carefully before answering. "I think they were men doing their jobs in a way that acknowledged my humanity. That's not heroic exactly, it's basic decency. But in the context of war, basic decency can feel miraculous." A girl asked, "Do you hate Japan for what they taught you?" Another difficult question. "I don't hate Japan," she said slowly. "I hate what war does to people, the lies it requires, the way it turns bodies into weapons and propaganda into truth. Japan was my home. It taught me many beautiful things, but it also taught me some terrible things. I had to learn which was which." The teacher thanked her for coming, and several students approached afterward to shake her hand, to thank her for her honesty. As she left the school with Sarah, she felt something shift inside her. Speaking the truth to these young people, seeing their genuine interest and empathy, had been different from speaking to adults who carried their own wartime baggage. These teenagers had no investment in maintaining particular narratives. They simply wanted to understand. And in their understanding, she found a kind of validation she had not experienced before. The Archive of Silences. In the 1980s, as Japan's economic miracle transformed the nation and a new generation came of age with no memory of the war, scholars began interviewing former prisoners of war. The young woman, now elderly, was contacted by a Japanese historian who was compiling oral histories of women's experiences during the conflict. She agreed to participate, traveling back to Japan for the first time in 30 years for the interview. Sitting in a Tokyo office building that stood where rubble had once been, she told her story again. But this time, she told it in Japanese, her mother tongue, and something about speaking in that language unlocked memories she had not accessed in years. She remembered phrases the guards had used, words she had learned from the California nurse, the taste of the first orange, the texture of the blanket. She remembered the woman who had wept over stew, the one who had kept broken glass under her pillow, the one who had asked, If the enemy values our lives, why do we not? The historian recorded everything, asking follow-up questions, pressing for details. Did you feel resentment toward the guards? She asked at one point. No, the woman answered. I felt confusion, then gratitude, then a strange kind of grief, because their restraint showed me how much violence had been normalized in my own culture. I had grown up thinking that being struck by a superior was normal, that hunger was proof of devotion, that suffering was virtue. The Americans didn't strike me, they fed me. They treated suffering as something to alleviate rather than glorify. That contrast was devastating. Devastating? The historian prompted, because it meant everything I had been taught about strength and honor was wrong. Or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. Twisted. Used to justify cruelty. The Americans were not perfect. They had their own propaganda, their own violences. But in this one interaction, this specific relationship between guard and prisoner, they offered me something my own nation never had. The acknowledgement that my body was not a tool to be used and discarded, but a life to be preserved. The historian nodded, making notes. Many women have been reluctant to speak about their experiences. Why do you think that is? Because the truth is complicated, the woman replied. It doesn't fit into the stories we tell about the war. In Japan, we want to remember ourselves as victims, as people who suffered nobly. To say that the enemy treated me well disrupts that narrative. In America, people want to remember themselves as liberators, as heroes. To speak honestly about the strategic calculations behind humane treatment, to admit that kindness was also a weapon that complicates the heroic narrative. So the truth sits in the space between uncomfortable to everyone. The interview was published as part of a larger collection, and the woman found herself surprised by the response. Young Japanese women wrote to her, thanking her for speaking openly about her experiences. Several said her testimony had helped them understand their own grandmothers, who had survived the war but never spoke of it. One letter came from a woman whose grandmother had been a prisoner in the same camp. She died never telling us the truth, the letter read. But your words helped me understand her silence. Thank you for breaking yours. The question that remained. In her final years, living in a small apartment in California with her daughter nearby, the woman often thought about the central question of her life. What did it mean that her enemies had treated her better than her own nation had? She turned this question over like a stone, examining it from every angle, never quite satisfied with any answer. She thought about the emperor's voice on the radio, announcing surrender, becoming mortal in that moment. She thought about the guard who had carried her bucket of water without expecting anything in return. She thought about her uncle saying it would have been better if she had not survived. She thought about the blanket, the orange, the spectacles that had allowed her to see clearly. She thought about the comb. Always, she came back to the comb. Such a small thing, so ordinary. Yet, in its ordinariness lay something profound, the suggestion that she mattered enough to maintain herself, that her appearance was worth preserving, that she had a future in which she might want to look presentable. The comb implied continuity, dignity, self-worth. It was the opposite of the cyanide capsule, which had implied only ending, erasure, the final negation of self. She kept that comb all these years later. It sat on her dresser, worn and missing a few teeth, but still functional. Sometimes she picked it up and ran it through her white hair, and she remembered being 20 years old and terrified, certain that her life was over. The comb had been a small prophet whispering, "You will survive this. You will need to comb your hair again. You have a future." When she died in 1998, her daughter found among her possessions a box of letters, some written in Japanese, some in English, all carefully preserved. They were letters from other former prisoners, women she had kept in contact with over the decades, sharing their stories, their struggles, their attempts to make sense of what they had lived through. Sarah read them all, weeping at the honesty they contained, the pain and confusion and hard-won wisdom. One letter from a woman named Keiko stood out. "Do you remember the night we talked about the guards, about how they never touched us? I said then that I didn't understand why they kept such distance. You said maybe they were afraid of us, afraid of what it would mean to acknowledge us as women, rather than just prisoners. I think about that often now. Maybe restraint is its own form of fear. Maybe choosing not to harm someone requires confronting your own capacity for harm. Maybe the guards who kept their distance were not just following orders, but wrestling with their own humanity. Sarah included these letters in a donation to a historical archive, ensuring that her mother's voice and the voices of these other women would be preserved. She wrote an introduction explaining her mother's journey from prisoner to immigrant to witness. She ended it with her mother's own words, spoken near the end of her life. "I was afraid they would touch me, and that fear defined my world. When they did not, when they chose restraint over violence, it didn't just save my body. It gave me back the possibility of trust, of believing that humanity could survive even in war's darkest places. That gift, strange and unexpected, shaped everything that followed. I spent my whole life trying to be worthy of it,